But if we've always had the potential to live to 70 or 80, does that mean our modern medicine hasn't actually done anything to extend our maximum lifespan? This is one of the most counterintuitive facts in all of biology. In 2007, researchers Michael Gervin and Hillard Kaplan published a massive study in the journal Population and Development Review. They analyzed data from small-scale hunter-gatherer and forager horticulturalist societies across the globe. They found that across all these different environments, the modal age of death, the most common age for an adult to die, was between 68 and 78 years old. This matches almost exactly with what we see in modern, developed nations if you remove deaths from lifestyle-related diseases like smoking or obesity. Our maximum, natural lifespan hasn't really changed in tens of thousands of years. A human being 40,000 years ago had the same basic cellular machinery we have today. We are still governed by the Hayflick limit, a concept discovered by Leonard Hayflick in 1961. He found that human cells can only divide a certain number of times, usually between 50 and 70 times, before they hit a state of senescence and stop. This limit is hard-coded into our DNA. It's the reason why, even with all our heart transplants and cancer treatments, we still see a massive wall around the age of 100. We haven't moved the finish line of human life, we've just cleared the track of all the hurdles that used to trip us up in the first mile. Modern medicine didn't create old age. It just made it common. But if the finish line is the same, why does the myth of the short-lived ancestor feel so vital to our modern identity? Why do we cling to the image of the brutish, 30-year-old caveman? It's because it reinforces a narrative of progress. It makes us feel that we are fundamentally different, perhaps even fundamentally better, than the humans who came before us. It allows us to view history as a straight line moving from misery to comfort. But the truth is much more humbling. It suggests that the ancient world wasn't a place of short-lived savages, but a place of survivors who were just as capable of long-term thinking, deep memory, and elderly wisdom as we are. When we look back at a 40-year-old in the Paleolithic, we aren't looking at a geriatric patient. We are looking at a person in the prime of their life, a person who was likely a pillar of their community. The grandmother digging for tubers in the Kalahari 20,000 years ago was the keeper of the group's maps. She knew where the water was hidden during the 5-year drought. She knew which plants could settle an upset stomach and which ones could stop a heart. She was the library of a species that hadn't yet invented books. If humans had really died at 30, we probably wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't have had enough time to pass on the complex cultural knowledge that allowed us to dominate every ecosystem on the planet. We are a species that relies on its elders to survive. The old man wasn't a burden, he was the hard drive. The old woman wasn't a relic, she was the engine of the next generation's survival. So, when we see those headlines or hear those fun facts about ancient humans never living past 30, we should recognize them for what they are, a statistical shadow. They are a reflection of how many children we lost, not a reflection of how long we were meant to live. Our ancestors were not a flash in the pan. They were a slow-burning fire. They lived through ice ages and volcanic eruptions and nomadic migrations that spanned continents. They did it by reaching old age, by becoming wise, and by teaching the young how to follow in their footsteps. They were never meant to be gone by 30. They were meant to be the masters of their world. But this brings us to a final, more sobering thought. If we have always been capable of living to 70 or 80, and if modern medicine has simply allowed more of us to reach that natural ceiling, what happens when we finally hit the wall? For the first time in human history, we are living in a world where reaching 70 is an expectation rather than a feat of survival. We have conquered the infant mortality that once dragged our averages into the dirt. We have blunted the edge of the infections that once turned a scratch into a grave. But in doing so, we have come face to face with the Hayflick limit, the hard, biological boundary of our own cells. We are the first generation of humans to collectively reach the end of the map our biology drew for us. And as we stand at that boundary, we have to wonder if we are really the masters of time we think we are. We look back at the old man of La Chapelle with a mix of pity and fascination, marveling that he made it to 60 without a pharmacy or a hospital. But perhaps he is the one who should be looking at us. He lived in a world where every year past 30 was a hard-won victory, a testament to the strength of his tribe and the depth of their care. He lived a life that was nasty, brutish, and short, only if you look at the spreadsheet. If you look at the man, you see a survivor who reached the very edge of what it means to be human. He lived until his body simply couldn't divide its cells anymore, surrounded by a group that valued his memory more than his muscles. The air in the cave is thick with the smell of damp limestone and the sharp, metallic tang of old wood smoke. You can feel the cold floor beneath you, a chill that seems to seep through your skin and settle deep into your joints, turning every movement into a slow, grinding ache. Your hip, damaged in a fall years ago, throbbed with the rhythm of your heartbeat. You reach up to touch your face, feeling the deep, weathered channels in your skin and the way your teeth have worn down into smooth, flat stones from a lifetime of grinding through tough roots and grit-covered meat. You are 45 years old. By every modern standard of ancient history you've ever been told, you should have been dead 15 years ago. You are a walking impossibility, a ghost inhabiting a body that the textbooks say was supposed to expire at 30. But as you look around the fire at the others in your group, you see more faces like yours, lined, gray, and very much alive. Why does the world insist you don't exist? But if your eyes aren't lying to you, where did we get the idea that 30 was the finish line for the human race? To understand why we've spent decades believing our ancestors lived at a dead sprint, we have to look at one of the most persistent and damaging statistical misunderstandings in the history of science. It's the myth of the average. When you hear that the average life expectancy in the Paleolithic or even the Roman era was 30, your brain naturally performs a bit of mental shorthand. You imagine a world where people hit their 20s, started looking like elders, and keeled over from old age by the time they reached 31. It creates a picture of a forever young species that never had time to grow wise. But this is a failure of math, not a reality of biology. Averages are a peculiar way of looking at a population because they can describe a person who never actually existed. If you have two people, and one dies at age 0 while the other lives to be 70, their average age of death is 35. But in that scenario, absolutely nobody died at 35. There is no 35-year-old in that data set. There is only an infant and an elder. For the vast majority of human history, this was the reality of our species. We didn't die at 30, we died at 0, or we died at 70. The average is a ghost, a number dragged into the basement by the weight of a horrific infant mortality rate. Before the advent of modern sanitation, antibiotics, and basic germ theory, the first 5 years of life were a gauntlet. If you could make it past the age of 5, your chances of seeing your 65th birthday didn't just improve, they became the standard. But if the math is so clearly skewed, why has the death at 30 narrative remained the default setting for how we view our past? Could it be that we simply haven't been looking at the bones closely enough? For a long time, archaeologists struggled with a very specific problem, telling the difference between a 40-year-old skeleton and a 60-year-old skeleton. When we look at a growing child, the bones provide a very clear clock. We can look at the fusion of the skull plates, the eruption of teeth, and the length of the femur to tell you exactly how old that child was within a matter of months. But once a human reaches adulthood and the bones stop growing, the clock stops ticking loudly. It begins to whisper. For decades, researchers relied on dental wear to estimate the age of ancient adults. They assumed that if the teeth were worn down to the gums, the person must have been old, and in their mind, old meant 35 or 40. They were effectively using their own bias to calibrate the clock. They didn't think people lived to 60, so when they saw an old person, they labeled them 40. This led to a massive underestimation of the elderly in the archaeological record. A landmark case that forced a rethink occurred in 1908 with the discovery of the Old Man of La Chapelle-aux-Saints. This was a Neanderthal skeleton found in France that lived roughly 60,000 years ago. When researchers first examined him, they were shocked. He was riddled with advanced osteoarthritis. He had lost most of his teeth. His jaw had healed over the empty sockets, meaning he had lived for years after losing his ability to chew. He was, by any definition, an old man. Early estimates placed him in his late 30s because, again, the bias of the time couldn't imagine a caveman being older. But more modern forensic techniques, looking at the microarchitecture of the bone and the specific patterns of joint degeneration, suggest he was likely well into his 50s or even 60s. He wasn't just a survivor, he was someone who had been cared for by his tribe. They had softened his food for him. They had carried him when his hips failed. But if these ancient groups were putting so much effort into keeping their elders alive, there must have been a biological reason for it, right? This is where we move from the how of survival to the why of evolution. In most of the animal kingdom, once you stop being able to reproduce, you are evolutionarily useless. Natural selection usually weeds out individuals who stick around after they can no longer pass on their genes. Yet humans have this strange, glaring exception: menopause. Human females can live for decades after their reproductive years end. For a long time, biologists viewed this as a glitch or a byproduct of modern living. But in the late 1990s, anthropologist Kristen Hawkes began studying the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last groups on Earth living a traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle. What she found turned the death at 30 myth on its head and gave us the grandmother hypothesis. Hawkes noticed that the most productive foragers in the Hadza society weren't the young men or the nursing mothers. They were the grandmothers. These older women spent more hours a day gathering tubers and hard-to-reach foods than anyone else. More importantly, they weren't eating all that food themselves. They were provisioning their grandchildren. By providing a consistent, high-calorie food source to the kids, they allowed the mothers to have their next baby sooner. The presence of a grandmother didn't just make the family happier, it made the family more evolutionarily successful. A woman with a surviving, hard-working mother had more offspring who survived to adulthood than a woman without one. Long life wasn't an accident of the modern world. It was a primary driver of human success. We didn't start living longer because we got civilized. We got civilized because we were already living long enough to build a culture. But if the biology was always there, does the historical record actually back up the idea that we were always a long-lived species? If we step out of the prehistoric caves and into the light of written history, the evidence becomes overwhelming. Take ancient Rome, for example. We often hear that the average life expectancy in Rome was about 25. Again, that number is a victim of infant mortality. But if we look at how the Romans actually structured their society, we see a culture obsessed with the elderly. The very word, senate, comes from the Latin word, senex, which literally means old man. The governing body of the most powerful empire on earth was named after the elderly because the elderly were the only ones perceived to have the gravitas and experience to lead. You don't name your supreme legislative body after a segment of the population that expires at 30. The Romans even had a sophisticated legal understanding of lifespans. In the 3rd century AD, a Roman jurist named Ulpian compiled what is now known as Ulpian's Life Table. It was used to calculate the value of annuities and inheritances. If the Roman state or a private citizen was going to pay someone a yearly sum for the rest of their life, they needed to know how long that life was likely to last. Ulpian's table didn't stop at 30. It provided calculations for people into their 60s and 70s. It assumed that a man who had reached the age of 20 had a very good chance of reaching the age of 50 or 60. The Romans weren't surprised by old people. They built their entire legal and political infrastructure around them. The history books haven't been lying about the numbers, but they have been letting us misinterpret them. But if the Romans and the Hadza and the Neanderthals were all reaching 60 or 70, what was actually happening to the people who didn't make it? If 30 wasn't a biological ceiling, it was certainly a gauntlet. To understand the death at 30 myth, we have to look at the 3 great filters of human history: childbirth, infection, and the environment. For women, the years between 15 and 30 were the most dangerous in history. Without the ability to perform C-sections or manage postpartum hemorrhage, childbirth was a coin toss. If a baby was positioned incorrectly, it was often a death sentence for both the mother and the child. This created a massive dip in the female population during their prime years, which further dragged down those average life expectancy numbers. Then, there was the invisible enemy. Before 1928, when Alexander Fleming stumbled onto penicillin, A simple scratch could be fatal. We live in a world where we've forgotten what it's like to fear a splinter or a blister. But for an ancient human, a minor wound that turned septic could result in a grueling death within days. There were no antibiotics to stop the spread of bacteria. There were no vaccines to prevent tetanus or smallpox. The 30-year-old who died in the ancient world didn't die because their body was worn out. They died because they ran into a microscopic wall that we have since dismantled. When we look back, we see the casualties of these filters and assume the species was weak. We forget that those who cleared the filters were remarkably robust. Is there a danger in thinking we've fixed the human lifespan? If we believe that 30 was once the end, we might believe that we can keep pushing the end further and further back, into 120, 150, or beyond. But the bones tell a different story. They tell us that we are the same as we were 50,000 years ago. We have the same capacity for wisdom, the same capacity for aging, and the same inevitable expiration date written into our marrow. We haven't changed the nature of life, we've only changed the odds of living it. We have traded the sudden, violent deaths of the ancient world for the slow, predictable decline of the modern one. We have traded the gauntlet for the ceiling. So, as you lay there in your mind, back on that cold cave floor, feeling the ache in your hip and the grit in your teeth, you can stop feeling like an impossibility. You are 45, and you are exactly where you are supposed to be. You are the link between the past and the future. You are the evidence that we have always been a species of elders. The fire in front of you is the same fire that will eventually burn out, no matter how much wood you pile on it. You aren't a mistake of history. You are the culmination of it. And while the textbooks might still repeat the number 30, the dirt and the bones and the grandmothers know the truth. They have always known. But even as we celebrate our victory over the average, we are left with the reality of the limit. We have spent 10,000 years trying to reach the age of 80, and now that we are there, we find that the wall is just as high as it ever was. We have cleared the path, but we haven't moved the mountain. We are a long-lived species in a world that is finally letting us prove it, and yet, the end remains as certain now as it was in the shadow of the cave. We have perfected the art of reaching the finish line, only to realize that the finish line was never meant to be moved. Does it change how you see yourself, knowing that your expiration date hasn't moved an inch since the Stone Age? It's a strange comfort to realize that we aren't better than our ancestors. We are simply luckier. We are the beneficiaries of a long-running experiment in social cooperation that started with a toothless Neanderthal and ended with a global healthcare system. We are the ones who got to see the end of the story that they started. But the story still has the same ending. It always has. And no amount of progress can change the fact that our time was measured out long before we ever learned to count it. So, the next time someone tells you that life was nasty, brutish, and short, remember the old man of La Chapelle. Remember the grandmothers of the Hadza. Remember that the 30-year-old caveman is a myth born from a misunderstanding of a decimal point. We have always been a species that grows old. We have always been a species that remembers. And we have always been a species that dies, not because we were weak, but because our time was simply up. The only thing that has changed is how many of us get to hear the clock strike 12. What will we do with the extra decades we've claimed from the average? Will we use them to build something as enduring as the memory of a grandmother, or will we simply wander closer to the wall, wondering why we can't climb over it? The answer likely lies in the same place it did 50,000 years ago, in the people we choose to keep alive and the stories we choose to tell them. We are the masters of the gauntlet, but we are still the subjects of the ceiling. As we look back at the long, gray line of our ancestors, we should see them not as tragic figures who died too young, but as the architects of the very longevity we enjoy today. They gave us the grandmother hypothesis. They gave us the Senate. They gave us the care that kept the toothless alive. They were the ones who decided that a human life was worth more than its reproductive output. And in doing so, they created the world we live in. A world where you can expect to grow old. A world where you can expect to be remembered. A world where 30 is just the beginning. Think about that sensation again. The ache in the hip, the weathered skin, the cold stone. It is not the feeling of a life ending. It is the feeling of a life that has endured. It is the physical weight of experience in a world that once tried to take it away. You are 45, and the fire is still burning. You have cleared the gauntlet, and the ceiling is still a long way off. For now, you are exactly where you were meant to be. And the statistics can say whatever they want. We have mastered the math of survival, but the biology of death remains undefeated. We have spent millennia convincing ourselves that we were once short-lived so that we could feel like we have conquered nature. But nature hasn't moved an inch. It has simply allowed us to fill the room it already built for us. We are living in the house of our ancestors, and the walls are exactly where they left them. The story of the 30-year-old human is a ghost story we tell ourselves to feel safe in the dark. It's a way of pretending that the end is something we've pushed back, rather than something we are simply reaching more often. But the truth is much heavier than that. It is a gavel strike on the desk of history, a final word on the nature of our species. We didn't invent old age. We just finally arrived at it. You were never supposed to die at 30. You were always supposed to be here, sitting by the fire, remembering the way the world used to be. You are the database. You are the survivor. You are the human being that evolution spent 6 million years perfecting. And as the fire dies down and the cold of the cave returns, you realize that the clock isn't ticking faster than it used to. It's just that, for the first time, everyone is listening to it. The myth of the short-lived ancestor is officially dead. But the reality that replaced it is far more haunting. We have gained the years, but we have lost the excuse. We are no longer the victims of a short, brutal life. We are the inhabitants of a long, inevitable one. And that is the heaviest truth of all. No matter how far we run, the finish line remains exactly where it was in the dirt. Nature doesn't negotiate with progress.